God's plan when the Quran is silent about it.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. So let's circle back to the title of your book, because it also refers to Reformist Islam. And when people hear the word reform, it can sometimes create tension because it sounds like changing religion itself, which is what non-traditional scholars, I think that's the number one accusation hurled at them, that, they're trying to change religion from what it is. But again, it is a little amusing because I mean, if you look at classical jurisprudence, the amount of changes um, and policies that they brought forth in understanding religion, I think it far outnumbers anything that non-traditional scholars are doing today, because we're talking about centuries of additions. Now, the question about this is, what does reform actually mean in the context of your book? And is reform about changing the religion, or is it about re-examining interpretations? There is a follow-up question to that, but let's start with that.
So I totally understand what your question, because reform can be translated in two different ways. And in fact, while you were talking, I was thinking that maybe the title of the book could be something a little bit clearer. But with consultation with the publisher and also looking at some of the scholarly writings I found, and I still believe that reform is a good word here. Reform can be interpreted in two different ways. One way is to say that we need to reform our methodology of understanding Islam, because there's something that doesn't make sense. So we need to reform that so that we can understand Islam better. Uh, the second meaning of reform could be that no, Islam is this, for instance, but this is not good enough. So we need to change it. We need to reform it. Uh, the reformist that the book title is saying definitely is not the second one. It's the first one. So it's about reforming the methodology. It's not about reforming Islam itself. Okay, it doesn't say reforming Islam. It says reformist Islam. Okay, so there's Islam is still there. Um, this reform, which is reforming the methodology, has always happened, as you said very, very nicely, has always happened in the scholarship of Islam. You always look at it; it was always changes, gradual or sudden changes in the methodology in different schools of thought, and it's not something bad; it's something very good, and I'm sure it's not going to be ended today or at this time or at this century. It will continue because human being keeps thinking. And as time changes, as the way that people live changes, people need to think about, okay, how am I going to understand this religion? Because sometimes they may find that some of my understanding might be totally wrong, might be affected by the tradition, might be affected by circumstances that generations before me had it. The scholars of Farahi School of Thought at one point uh, even argued that they can call their approach the originalist approach. And what they meant by that was that they themselves will argue that their approach is that origin approach of Islam, the original approach of Islam. This is the approach of the companions of the Prophet. This is the way that they would understand Islam. Of course, then later, this only came from one of the scholars of the Farahi schools of thought. It wasn't invested on that much, this terminology of original approach. And as Javed Ahmed Qamadi said, the name of the approach needs to be Farahi School of Thought, because it originated from Hamiduddin Farahi. So yes, this is not about changing Islam. This is about changing, improving, and reforming and reviewing our methodology of understanding Islam.
Right.
Follow-up question. You said there is a second
Oh,
question,
yes,
yeah?
yes. So this just ties into whether you think reinterpretation is necessary for religion to remain intellectually alive. Do you think it's something that needs to be done over and over again? Because then it does bring with it a lot of implications.
Yes, definitely. So, if we believe that, so again, I'm trying to limit my discussion about this because it's something that I think we'll talk about it later in more detail. But briefly speaking, if we believe that the message of Islam came from the Almighty, no matter what is our belief about the process and the mechanism of revelation, it only makes sense that the Almighty brought this message 1400 years ago. Definitely the message needed to fit those people and to be appropriate for those people. Otherwise, they couldn't apply, they couldn't adopt it, they couldn't even accept it. So it needed to be something that would help that society. As societies change, as knowledge change, we need to understand what the essence of that message is. And where possible, we need to try to see what it means for our time. Okay? Give you examples. So, for instance, when the Quran talks about penal law, like murder and all that, it is talking about it at the time that there was no science of psychology in place. Okay, so now we have different sciences like psychology, sociology, all these sciences, and we now know that yes, some people may not all murderers, but some murderers might be just psychopaths. You know, it's just something that unfortunately is a part of their system, and they cannot help it. Can we then punish them the same way that the Quran says? It may not be fair if we think about it that way, because it was God's creation that made them to be like this. The society that was at the time of the Prophet was a society in which war and fighting with sword and killing, etc., was something quite normal. It wasn't like now that there's a few seconds of somebody hitting somebody and there's a warning, oh, this may affect you. If you want, don't see it. It wasn't like that. People would see bloodshed in the streets and it's just a normal thing happening. It was a society in which men, in particular, had a very important role compared to women. Not because they would work and all that, some women would work as well, but because they could participate in battles, in wars. So for that society, the verses came, regulations came. Question is, can we apply the same thing to a society that is not totally in a different situation, totally different circumstances? I think if we have a static understanding of religion, what will happen is that the new and the dynamic circumstances of life take over from us. And we remain like fossils. We remain like with an understanding of Islam that is only good for our own circles to sit down and talk about it on a Friday evening. It's not going to have any benefit or any application in the real world and for the life of people. The best understanding of Islam will be the one that is applicable for the time and circumstances that people live. And that would require having this dynamic and continuous revision of our understanding. That doesn't mean that we are changing Islam. That means we are changing our understanding of Islam and verses of the Quran and Hadith and all that, which we'll talk about it, I hope, later.
Yes.
Before asking you if there's any other question, let me just say that once the 4 case studies in the book are finished, then comes a chapter which is the methodological features of the Farahi School of Thought. In that chapter, I have critically discussed, I have basically derived 12 methodological features from the 4 case studies. And I explain these 12 methodological features, which I would call them methodological features of the Farahi School of Thought. And I have critically discussed them, talked about their strengths and their challenges and maybe contradictions and weaknesses. And then in the conclusion chapter, I have basically tried to categorize and group scholarly thought about Islam and interpreting the Quran into 4 categories. Mm-hmm. So the first category would be traditionalists. These are what this book refers to them as traditional scholars. So these are the ones who are very much interested in the famous view of the past scholars. So that would be traditionalists. The second group would be textualists. So these are the ones who in particular emphasize on looking at the Quran and having the Quran to have the highest criteria in understanding Islam. So Farahi scholars would be in the textualist group. The third group would be contextualist. So the contextualists are the ones that say the things that I just said right now. That, for instance, we need to see what was the context of the society in which some of these regulations came. And if the context has changed, then we need to revise these regulations. So they try to understand the verses of the Quran based on the social context, the historical context, and therefore try to argue and discuss about reinterpretation of some of these verses when the context is different. The fourth group, I call them theorists. And theorists are those who discuss about the mechanism of regulation. And argue that we can actually raise this question that the actual text of the Quran, for instance, are the words themselves exactly what God gave to the Prophet, or was it the outcome of a process in which revelation came to the heart of the Prophet? And it was then transferred into words. But in this transfer of meaning, transfer of concept to meaning and words, the Prophet himself, in a way, had an effect on it as a human being. So this is, for instance, what Fazlur Rahman, the Pakistani scholar, talks about it, who passed many years ago. He migrated to America later from Pakistan. So Fadlur Rahman says that the revelation has 2 sides in it. One side is totally divine, and that is because it comes from the Almighty. One side is totally humane, because it's a human being that is receiving it. And of course, they're discussing in much detail, which I'm sure we will talk about it later. So in these 4 groups, the Farahi scholars are in the second group, which is textualist. And one of the main criticisms that I had for the textualist scholars, including Farahi scholars, was that it seems like they were not entertaining the arguments of, for instance, contextualists. What I mean by entertaining means that being in touch with them, seeing their arguments, revising their arguments, criticizing their arguments, answering their arguments. I don't see that happening. But then also what I said was that for common Muslims, I can fully understand that being loyal to the text and literal meaning of text is something very important. For the common Muslim, I fully understand that they may find it too difficult to accept the contextualist approach, and definitely very, very, very difficult to think about the theorist approach and even think about revelation. They would consider it as blasphemy. They really like to see arguments based on the text. It's because of this that I wrote at the end of my book that despite all the challenges that I think this school of thought has, despite the fact that I myself am not belonging to their paradigm, I still believe that this school of thought can serve Muslims very well. And their findings can be of benefit to many, many Muslims. Because of what I just said, that I think the mass of Muslims prefer an approach that is still loyal to the literal meaning of the text. And this school of thought is doing that, but is doing that rationally and with emphasizing on the Quran. And therefore, already they have come up with an understanding that makes much more sense when you compare it with the traditional understanding.
Right, right. But even looking at Ustad Ghamadi's organization, there's a lot of research that can is not just attributed to the text alone. It takes into account history. It takes into account the events that were happening at that time. It may even take into account the linguistics of that time. So sometimes do you think it's a disservice that most people are educated in the holy text, but they aren't educated in whatever was surrounding it at the time?
Um, yes, uh, so are you asking me whether this is the right approach to take by Ahmadi and scholars, or what is your question again?
It's not particularly about Ustad Ghamadi's
Uh,
organization. I think because when I think about my country, well, first of all, most people are simply taught, how to read the Quran. Um, without translation also. But even if they do go on to teach them translation, I think it just, kind of again, like you said, they fixate on that alone. And I just feel like maybe there should be a couple of more things that should be added to when the holy text was revealed, what was the culture at that time, what was the historical context at that time, um, linguistics of that time.
Sure. Yeah. So, of course, when a scholar of Islam looks at text like the Quran, of course they look at linguistic as well. Of course, they look at the culture, they look at the norms of that time, what this particular terminology meant at the time. Of course, they do that. And the Farahi scholars, Ustad Qamadi also, they also do that. Of course, they do that. But the reason I call them textualists is that at the end of the day, once they do that, uh, on the basis of that, they come up with an understanding, literal understanding of a verse of the Quran. Once they derive at that literal understanding, whether right or wrong, this is it. This is the end of the journey for them. So they consider it as done. This is strictly something that is written in the stone and cannot change it. These are the textualists. The contextualist will say, okay, hang on. Yes, the Quran does say, for instance, that cut the hand of the thief. I can see it says that. Mr. or Lady Textualist, I can see it says that. But this was for that time. This was for the time of the Prophet, in that area, for a society who already would capture the thieves and would just cut different parts of their body. And for them it says, just cut the hand, cut the hand. So it was appropriate for that society. It's not for our society. So that would be the contextualist. The Farahi scholars are textualists. They are not contextualists.
Right, right. Okay. Well, that's a great clarification. And speaking of revisions, or even context and text, um, you are someone that has always been open to revisions. I think right from when you developed your website, you've made it a point to specifically note that, hey, like this is the date today, and this is my understanding today, but it's always subject to change if I encounter different information. So, in your journey of writing this book, and after you wrote and researched this book, even though you said that was derived from your thesis, However, did any idea or conclusion personally surprise you? Um, yeah, that's the question.
It was through the process of not because writing the book was actually just transforming my PhD to a book. Okay, so let me reword your question and say throughout the PhD process, whether something like that happened. I remember I said I belong to a different paradigm. Well, that happened because of that PhD. In the whole process of this PhD, when I get to know better the Farahi School of thought and then comparing it with traditional, and then because of the work that I was doing, I looked at the contextualist approach, I looked at those that I call them theorists and all that. That causes me to, and towards the end of my PhD, I found that okay, this is a great school of thought, but I cannot consider myself anymore to be following this school of thought, although I've learned a lot from them, and I still believe in many of the things that they say. I totally agree with them, like the concept of Itmam al-Hujjah, like Quran being at the top, like the definition of Sunnah. I definitely believe with all, agree with all of that. But I ended up in a different paradigm. That was if I may say, thanks to my PhD process, or according to some people, they might say it was my PhD that was guilty of that and threw me into that side. More generally, if I want to say something about revising and revising, I remember I was like 20, 22, 25 years old, and I was reading a book at the time, and I had a specific understanding of Islam at the time. And this is not about any mazhab, it's not about Shia or Sunni or anything. No, it's just about understanding of Islam. Uh, and I was so pleased with my understanding that I did sajda, prostration, and I did shukr, thanking to God. Thank you, God, for this understanding, which I think is the most correct understanding of Islam. That was when I was like 25 years old. I was thinking that my reasonings were the strongest reasoning ever. Nobody can argue against them. And people who have different understanding are totally misunderstanding Islam. Uh, Today, now, my views are totally different from the view of that boy at the age of 25 who did that prostration. And the reasoning that I had at that time, if I hear them now, I would just laugh at them because I think they're just so weak and shaky reasoning. That experience has caused me to never believe that my understanding is 100% correct. It's my final understanding. No, I believe in my understanding strongly enough to talk about it and to share it with others. But I do not take myself serious enough to think that this is the final and 100% understanding. It might be wrong, or I may change it. And that's what human being is. And I think if any human being at any point reaches to the point that thinks that this is it, my understanding is not fixed, final, I'm not going to think about it anymore, that's when the person is losing all that value of that a human being was supposed to have, which is thinking and thinking and revising and revising. Uh, if I do prostration today and do shuk and say thank you, it's not going to be because of my understanding. It's going to be because of the fact that I do see in myself that I do have the courage to change and revise my understanding if I honestly find that it needs revision.
Well, that is, I think, amongst contemporary scholarship of Islam, a very rare thing to have. So maybe your prostration did get rewarded after all. Um, So as we aim towards the closing, Dr. Shafti, first of all, thank you for joining us and for sharing these insights. Your book invites readers to think deeply about how religious understanding develops and how interpretation shapes belief. For those interested in exploring these ideas further, the book is again titled The Farahi School and Reformist Islam. But just before I close this episode, I think I always ask you a very similar question. What do you hope readers, whether they're believers, skeptics, or simply curious, take away from your work?
Well, I've actually in the introduction of the book, there's a section that says how this book may be of interest to different groups of people. The book can be read in different ways. The people who are interested in any of those case studies can simply just go directly to those case studies and read them. The chapters are not depending on each other. So, for instance, a person might be interested in the case study of hijab. He can just go and read that chapter, and that would be it. The people who are interested in methodologies and how different methodologies in Islam work, they can read some of the case studies and they can jump into the discussion chapter and the conclusion chapter when I'm comparing these methodologies and all that. The people who are really interested in the Farahi school of thought and how it is, they can read the whole thing from beginning to the end, and to see how this approach is. And let me read this part from the introduction, if I may. Yeah, how to read this book and what not to expect. So it goes like this. If you are seeking clarity on the controversial issues discussed in the 4 case studies, if you are curious to have a snapshot of how traditional scholars have generally approached these topics, and most importantly, if you wish to understand how one can remain relatively loyal to the Quranic text, yet arrive at significantly different conclusions, as demonstrated by the Farahi approach, then you are in the right place. I offer a few suggestions here. Now it says, if you're an academic or researcher looking to understand the Farahi school of thought in depth, then reading this book from the beginning to end will likely help you. I'm reading just lines of it. If you are mainly curious about the Farahi's perspectives on these topics, you may wish to just bypass the sections on contested aspects and traditional approaches and just jump into the part that I'm talking about the Farahi views on that. If you are a follower of Javed Ahmed Qamadi and already familiar with their views, you may be particularly interested in the interview sections at the end of the chapters, because these interviews are unique. I mean, you don't find them in any other place. And I've written, and if by any chance you are Qamadi himself or one of his close students, I especially recommend reading chapters 7 and 8, which is discussion and conclusion, as well as some of my critical discussions in the interview sections. It is always valuable to view one's work through the analytical lens of an external researcher, particularly when that researcher has sought to document the methodological features of your approach. So yes, the book can be utilized and read in different ways, depending on what the interest of the reader is.
And is there any place in the book where you've mentioned why specifically you chose these particular 4 cases?
Yes. So again, in the introduction, I've explained that I chose these cases because these are controversial cases, and I knew that the Farahi scholars, or at least Javed Ahmed Qamadi, had different views about them. I intentionally included 2 cases where Javed Ahmed Qamadi had different views from his teacher, Amin Ahsan Islahi. So it was interesting to see how within the same methodological framework, two leading scholars will come up with two different conclusions. I intentionally added return of Jesus to the cases so that we have at least one case study that is not about legal issues like stoning and hijab and all that, but is more about the belief and matters of belief.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for explaining all of that. And to our viewers, thank you for watching Beyond Dogma, where we explore difficult questions about faith and thought with openness, curiosity, and most of all, tolerance. I'm your host, Irtiqa Sheral, with our esteemed guest, Dr. Shafti, and we'll see you in the next episode. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. Salam.